The ancient cities of the land of Israel are perhaps the most fascinating places to visit while in the land. Most are protected sites under the control of the Israeli Antiquities Authority, and many are active archaeological digs. Perhaps none is more fascinating and well preserved as that of Beit She'an. Located in the lush Jordan Valley just south of the Sea of Galilee, this city dates back to the Neolithic period, some 7,500 years ago. In the 3rd century of the Common Era, the city was at its peak. Rabbi Simon ben Lakish said of it, "If the Garden of Eden is the land of Israel, then its portals are in Beit She'an." I'm Dan Cathcart, and this is Shadows in the Land of Israel. As with most such antiquities sites in the land of Israel, what we see of the exposed excavations are the cities as they existed at the time of the Roman occupation or shortly thereafter, with bits and pieces of earlier occupations as the archaeologists have uncovered them. This is true of Beit She'an as well, with its marble columns, bathhouses, basalt-paved streets with plumbing and sewage removal systems. There are also the remains of various temples, as well as a well-preserved Roman-era amphitheater at the very heart of the ancient Beit She'an. Much of what we see today was excavated and preserved in the last century, and particularly since the re-establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. But just below the surface, and written in the history books and chronicled in the Bible, is a story that is far older, reaching back in time to bring us lessons from the past. The name Beit She'an in Hebrew means house of ease. It comprises of 2 words, Beit, and of course which means house, and She'an is a primitive root meaning to lull or to be peaceful, be at ease, be quiet, to rest. But when we study the history of Beit She'an, we find that it is anything but a peaceful place. In ancient times, the strategic location of Beit She'an made it a frequent target for conquests and control. It stood on a stretch of highway which linked the northern coast of Israel with the region of Transjordan. Just to the east of Beit She'an is the road that links up with the primary north-south route through the Jordan Valley to the Hula Valley and on to Lebanon. And from the 16th to the 12th centuries BCE, the Egyptians made Beit She'an a regional center and a stronghold in the land of Canaan. In the book of Judges, chapter 5, the Song of Deborah speaks of the time at the end of the Egyptian rule, as the Bronze Age is just coming to a close. Look at Judges 5, verses 6 through 9. In the days of Shamgar, son of Anath, in the days of Jael, the highways were deserted, and the travelers walked along the byways. Village life ceased. It ceased in Israel, until I, Deborah, arose a mother in Israel. They chose new gods. Then there was war in the gates. Not a shield or spear was seen among 40,000 in Israel. My heart is with the rulers of Israel, who offered themselves willingly with the people. Bless the Lord. So as the Israelites came into the Promised Land, the city of Beit She'an, which at this point had existed for more than 2,000 years, was in the territory assigned by the tribe of Manasseh. But the tribe was unable or unwilling to complete the takeover of the city, and instead chose to settle with the Canaanites already there, whom they pressed into slavery. Look at Joshua 17, verses 11 through 13. And in Issachar and in Asher, Manasseh, and Beth She'an and its towns, Iblim and its towns, the inhabitants of Dor and its towns, the inhabitants of Endor and its towns, the inhabitants of Tanakh and its towns, and the inhabitants of Megiddo and its towns, 3 hilly regions. Yet the children of Manasseh could not drive out the inhabitants of those cities. But the Canaanites were determined to dwell in that land, and it happened when the children of Israel grew strong that they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not utterly drive them out. One of the most significant historical events to take place at Beit She'an is recorded in the book of 1 Samuel, where a fierce battle takes place between the army of King Saul and his sons against the Philistines on the nearby Mount Gilboa. The Philistines are brutal in their treatment of prisoners, so Saul, mortally wounded in this battle, orders his own men to slay him before the Philistines can abuse him, but they refuse. Look at 1 Samuel 31, 1-10. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines, and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. Then the Philistines followed hard after Saul and his son, and the Philistines killed Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, Saul's sons. The battle became fierce against Saul. The archers hit him, and he was severely wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword, and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised men come and thrust me through and abuse me." But his armor-bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell on it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword, and died with him. So Saul, his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all of his men died together that same day. And when the men of Israel, who were on the other side of the valley, and those who were on the other side of the Jordan, saw that the men of Israel had fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they forsook the cities and fled, and the Philistines came and dwelt in them. So it happened the next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa, and they cut off his head and stripped off his armor, and sent word through the land of the Philistines to proclaim it in the temples of their idols and among the people. Then they put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths, and they fastened his body to the wall of Beit She'an. There is some, but very little archaeological evidence of any appreciable Philistine presence in Beit She'an following this battle against Saul's army, despite the biblical account of the Philistines' dominance during this time. The Philistines most likely remained only for a short time and then retreated back south to their homeland. 1 Kings chapter 4 gives a long list of regional governors under the reign of King Solomon and mentions the governor of Beit She'an in verse 12. The city remained in Israelite control until the time of the Assyrian conquest in 732 BCE, after which it remained in ruins and was mostly uninhabited for nearly 400 years. Beit She'an was reborn when Alexander the Great conquered the region in the latter half of the 4th century BCE. At this time, the city became a Greek polis, or city-state. It quickly grew to one of the largest in the region, known collectively as the Decapolis. Beit She'an was known at this time by the name Scythopolis, or Nysa Scythopolis. In Greek history and literature, this is a city of the Scythians. According to Pliny the Elder, was founded by Dionysus as a burial place for his wet nurse Nysa. Many statues of Dionysus has been unearthed at Beit She'an, attesting to the fact that Dionysus worship was a central part of the city activity during this time. After the death of Alexander the Great and the division of his vast empire to his 4 generals, the land of Israel changed hands many times between the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid kingdoms. Attesting to this are coins excavated at Beit She'an from this period with the inscription of Ptolemy Philadelphus II, who reigned from 283 to 245 BCE. The city was once again returned to Jewish hands with the conquest by the Hasmoneans in 104 BCE. Its Greek inhabitants were given the choice at that time to convert to Judaism or leave. Most chose the latter, and the city was restored to its biblical name of Beit She'an and repopulated with a Jewish majority. Hasmonean rule was short-lived, however, being toppled by Roman conquest in 63 BCE. Beit She'an was once again in pagan hands, and at the time of the Great Revolt of 66 to 70 CE, the pagan residents, the number of which had swelled greatly under Roman rule, massacred the remaining Jewish population. Beginning at the time of Emperor Hadrian, the city became a thriving metropolis, growing to more than 400 acres, and reaching its pinnacle during the time of Emperors Antonius Pius and Marcus Aurelius. Most of the ruins which are accessible today are a small portion of the remains from this time in the history of this important city. The latter history is much more known and has been written about in many books and historical accounts. The Roman occupation, which spanned from 63 to 324, was followed by the Byzantines from 324 to 640. The early Arab period began in 640. Then in 1029, the European Crusaders took control and occupied the city until 1291. That's when the Mamluks took control and held the city until 1516. This was followed by the Ottoman period, which lasted until their defeat by the British in World War I in 1917. And finally, the city is once again in Jewish hands with the establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948. Beit She'an has been continuously occupied since the time of its rebuilding during the reign of Alexander the Great. Today it is a thriving modern city which lies above a portion of the ruins of ancient Beit She'an. The ancient ruins and archaeological site are a protected Israeli national park, accessible year-round, and should be on anyone's list of must-see places in the land of Israel. Here at Beit She'an, you can walk on the very streets of the Greek and Roman era city. You can sit on the stone benches in the amphitheater and stroll through the ancient temples, the bathhouses, and the other public places. And if you stand on its main street and listen very carefully, in the quiet, restful peace which it now enjoys, this ancient and beautiful city may reveal its secrets to you. Thank you for watching today. I'm Dan Cathcart, and this is Shadows in the Land of Israel. Shalom, and be blessed.